What do you think would happen if you were to go to that class? I wouldn't know what to do. Okay, why would that be such a bad thing? Well, if I don't know what to do, I'm going to look stupid. Okay, why does it matter to you that people think that you look stupid? Well, I want to make sure that I impress people. Okay, what about you makes you think that you won't impress people? Well, because I'm a failure. And then before you know it, kind of by burying down into using these questions, you get to this core belief of I'm a failure. And I'm avoiding this class because I'm scared it's going to confirm this belief that I have that I can't do it. It took you, 20 plus years to develop that belief in the first place? So this is a long process, but it's worth it. And if you can find joy in that process, then all the better, because it's going to encourage you to keep going.
Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of the Introspection podcast with your host Zach Villeneuve-Snell. In this week's episode I am joined by Dr. Martha Harrison, who is a clinical psychologist who did her university dissertation on masculinity and mental health. And so in this discussion we talk about how to find purpose in your 20s, the psychology of the matrix and taking the red pill, how to overcome self-limiting beliefs, the importance of introspection and examining yourself and others under that psychological lens that I bang on about so often. It was really great to hear that perspective from a clinical psychologist in the field. The differences in men's and women's mental health, and of course circling back and talking more in detail about men's mental health. We talk about how to establish your passions and the human life cycle, again particularly focusing in on your 20s. Many of you may know that I myself want to become a clinical psychologist a number of years down the line after the arduous process of doing the doctorate and gaining experience, and that's something that Dr. Martha Harrison has obviously gone through, so it was really exciting for me to sit down and chat with her and just kind of pick her brains on a wide variety of topics that are really not only useful from an intellectual perspective of like, oh, that's interesting, but also they're really applicable to our lives, and she really spoke into some great topics, as I've mentioned. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Dr. Martha Harrison. Dr. Martha Harrison, welcome to the Introspective podcast. How are you?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm good, thank you. And it's great to be here. So genuinely, thank you ever so much for inviting me on.
If I was to ask you what the film The Matrix means to you, how would you answer?
Okay, number one, it's kind of blown my mind that you've asked that, because people who know me will know that is my favourite film ever. What does it mean to me? Oh, well, I think the deep meaning behind The Matrix, I guess it's all about escaping convention, questioning reality, thinking about the role of perception in life. So I'm really curious about what made you ask that, because that's so close to home. It's actually quite freaky. So yeah, can you give a bit of context behind the question?
I saw you mentioned somewhere on Instagram caption, and you said, you even mentioned yourself, people close to me know that this is something close to me. But just curious, because obviously it's quite a widely referenced film these days, with whether you take the blue pill, take the red pill, whether you are integrated within the comforts and the niceties of society and not willing to question and go deeper, or whether you are. And I thought, obviously, as a clinical psychologist, hearing that was potentially one of your favorite films or means something to you spoke to me is like, well, that's quite interesting. So I'll ask about it. So
Yeah, I forgot that was on a caption. So good research.
yeah.
Yeah, it's an example of synchronicity. Yeah, red pill club all day. But it's, that temptation to go back to real life once you've started questioning things in that way. It's the comfort of the blue pill, but then that curiosity that takes you to that place of the red pill. And it's kind of a storyline that features in many different films. It's like Alice in Wonderland, The Matrix, all these different ideas, which is around, delving deeper into the fabric of reality that just gets my imagination going.
Why is it that you think so many people aren't willing to quote unquote take the red pill? And I don't mean this in terms of like the way that the word red pill is used currently in like dating relationships,
Yeah, just thought
but more
that.
broadly. Yeah.
I had a supervisor once, and he was so influential in terms of developing my career as a psychologist. One of the first things he told me was, when you're working therapeutically with someone, the first thing you need to know is that people do anything to resist change. Change is one of the scariest things in the world, and yet it's one of the few things that is guaranteed. So if we think about that concept around change and what that means in terms of, I guess, this red pill concept, I guess it means taking a risk. It means entering the unknown. And even though change is inevitable, it's the one thing that people resist because it's so scary. And it means taking a plunge into uncertainty. And as human beings, we like predictability, we like comfort, we like familiarity because we feel like it keeps us safe. So I think people stick with what's safe and what's known, even if it's not necessarily in their best interests, because I'd rather be safe than sorry.
One of the quotes you've also shared on Instagram is truth is like poetry, and most people hate poetry, is a quote by Adam McKay.
It's an interesting one, actually, because my dad's a poet. So we had kind of an introduction to poetry in the household, and most people do effing hate poetry by the quote. This pursuit of the truth, I think it's quite a hot topic at the moment. And it's a really complicated question because it's just this idea of like, is there one universal truth, or are there multiple truths that people have access to depending on their life story? So are we all in the pursuit of this one idea of truth, or do we all have individual truths that it's our life venture to pursue individually? And I think in terms of coming to terms with your own truth, again, this is quite a scary process because when you take a long, hard look at yourself, inevitably you find things that you don't like. And most people will avoid the process of looking at themselves because they don't want to come to terms with the parts of themselves that they can't bear other people to see. So I think in terms of this pursuit of your own truth, it requires an awful lot of courage and bravery.
It reminds me of a quote I saw. I don't know if it was Jordan Peterson specifically that made it up or whether he was quoting someone else. But it was like, people don't like to do the inner work because they find out they're often, like burning off dead wood is obviously painful, and they find out a large proportion of them is dead wood in terms of, the things that they've been holding on to that they perhaps should address and look into and work out ways into kind of moving forward with their lives, which is interesting. But obviously I haven't actually introduced what it is that you do and who you are today. We've kind of just delved straight in. So if you were to summarize who you are in 2023 for the listeners, just to provide a bit of context before we rewind back, how would you do so?
Yeah, difficult question to answer. Who am I? So I'm Martha. I'm a clinical psychologist. And for those who don't know what that means, I guess essentially it means that I've dedicated my career to work with a wide variety of people with a wide variety of mental health difficulties, with an overarching aim to reduce distress and improve well-being. So that's kind of the technical definition of clinical psychology. And in terms of practicalities, that means I work therapeutically with people, both one-to-one, couples work and family work. And it also means that I take part in kind of assessments of functioning. So the less clinical definition, and I like to look into the etymology of words. This is like the origin of how language evolved. So if you look at psychologist, it comes from the Latin, which is psyche and logia. Psyche, I guess a rough translation is soul, and logia, a rough translation, is the study of. So my preference in terms of what a psychologist is to give this juicy definition. It's a person who studies the soul.
I really like that. That's a great way of putting it. And so obviously studying the soul is quite a deep philosophical thing, and coming into why you wanted to pursue that and kind of rewinding back before we delve into perhaps some of the topics that you specialize in or that we're going to talk into today. A question I always ask, which often people kind of like answering because it's kind of doing, I suppose it's kind of what you do in your profession, but reversed. So like, if you were to tell me about yourself as a child, how would you describe yourself as a child? What were you like?
I was reserved. I was quiet. I was introspective, I guess in other terms. I was very inquisitive. I liked to observe and see how things worked, in particular people, which understandably is a bit of a golden thread that's connected my career. I'm more of kind of an observer role more than anything else. So I guess to give an example, myself, I've got an older brother. We're like truly best friends. We were Batman and Robin growing up. We used to play like imaginary games. I was always Robin, by the way. And it's kind of taking that back seat and watching other people thrive. So if we used to play like video games, we had a PlayStation 2 once. We had like a shared birthday present, not birthday, Christmas present. It was like the best gift we ever had. But I would never play it. I like to watch him play. So I was much more interested in kind of watching people live their lives rather than kind of taking part in the game itself. So I guess that kind of observer role, taking a bit of a back seat and watching other people do their thing, I think that is something that's lent itself quite well to my career as a psychologist. And I think people who knew me as a kid would probably say it's probably quite appropriate. I was kind of in the background in a curious way, but also in quite a shy and reserved way. It was a bit of a double-edged sword.
Why do you think that was the case? Like, was it, I mean, you obviously mentioned shyness. I guess that's like a lack of confidence or wanting to do it yourself. But was there any sort of like, I don't know, like fear of embarrassment or any kind of reason why you've understood why you were kind of potentially more observant?
Yeah, probably a touch of that. I think I found it all very overwhelming. I think, well, understand when you come into the world, I mean, it's like integrating into the matrix, as we said before. There's an awful lot of moving parts. And I think I found people in particular quite overwhelming. Kind of observing kind of the social norms, observing how people made conversation, how they played. And there's probably an element of that, like you say, about trying to get it right, maybe trying to avoid embarrassment, trying to do things well. And I think for a while that kind of held me back ever so slightly. And I think throughout my life, as I've gotten older, it's definitely that kind of becoming more accepting of who you are and becoming more kind of self-confident and self-assured. And that's kind of giving me the ability to take up a bit more space and come into the foreground a bit more.
Would you say that's in tandem with becoming more educated and more specialized? Because I've heard quotes before that confidence really should be linked to competence, because as you do become more knowledgeable or more of an expert in something, then internally you can recognize that you do have the authority to make comment or talk about something, whereas potentially before a lack of confidence sometimes is justified if you don't actually know what you're talking about. So would you say that that's kind of been alongside in that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an influential psychotherapist called Vygotsky, and he talks about this kind of when you start any venture into knowledge, I guess we all start out from a place of unconscious incompetence, meaning we don't necessarily know what we don't know. We're just at the start of the journey. And in the process, you go through quite a painful stage where it's conscious incompetence. You become very aware of what you don't know, and you're very aware of how far you have to go in your kind of knowledge journey. And you kind of enter through these stages to a point where eventually you come to a place of conscious competence, which I guess clues in the name. You become aware of the things that you do know. You're also aware of your pitfalls. But in order to progress to that point, it's necessary to have this stage where you do feel like an imposter.
You've mentioned that you were introspective as a child, and one of the things that I've reflected on is my understanding, my curiosity and understanding of myself has led to my curiosity and understanding of others, because I'm obviously like trying to work out why I think and feel and act, and then you kind of observe how people do that differently, and that kind of sparks the curiosity even more. And so did this play a factor in when you were choosing your pathway in terms of choosing psychology to pursue as a further study?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it all starts with the self, and as you say, you start to understand difference through that position of understanding who you are. You only can understand how other people work if you can have a comparison to a certain extent. And I think that self-analysis is such an important part of becoming a psychologist. I know in certain courses, especially psychoanalytical courses, it's mandatory that you have your own therapy alongside your training. It isn't for clinical psychology, and there are kind of complex reasons behind that. But personally, I did take part in my own psychotherapy, and it was such a valuable experience, because I think you can only go so far with your self-analysis, because as individuals, we are so biased when it comes to understanding who we are. And sometimes you get caught in these loops. So you just about think that you understand a part of yourself, and then you realize that you've been circulating in this loop and you need someone to break that cycle. So I think introducing that external perspective, whether it's a friend, a partner, a family member, a therapist, is so important in that venture to come to understand who you are and how you work. So for me, it was a very internal process, but also kind of recruiting these external perspectives along the way. And in doing so, and in applying some of the theory to myself in terms of psychological theory, it's only when I've had that experience of applying to myself that I feel confident enough to share that with other people, because you have an experience of how it works rather than just a superficial understanding of why.
I think that's important to, I mean, in any field, I suppose, if someone is giving advice or claiming to be an authority in some particular specialization, it's probably a good idea for them to recognize that where it's affected them in their own life.
It's that translation of education into experience. It's like you can know something, you can take in all the information that you have. And I mean, we have more information at our fingertips than we ever have at any point in history. And information and education doesn't necessarily translate into action. So you can keep absorbing information about a topic all you like, but until you start putting that into kind of practical use, you often don't have those kind of penny drop moments.
The perfect example of this that kind of springs to mind off the back of that is, I think, Jordan Peterson and Jocko Willink, two kind of like people in this space. They both kind of sat down and did a podcast, and they both had this kind of realization that even though one has been in theory like the theorist, doing the research and whatnot, and the other person has been on the front lines in the US Navy, I think, or military, I can't remember. But they came to the same conclusions about human nature, about all these like different ways in which psychology reveals itself in different scenarios. And it's really interesting because someone has studied it deeply and the other one has lived it deeply to the nth degree and have come to the exact same conclusions. So I think that kind of stresses the importance of going and actually experiencing and doing, and not just kind of, I suppose, just studying as a theoretical thing.
Absolutely. And this is why I love psychology, because it's not just about the mind. Again, it's that kind of study of the soul and what that means. And it's this integration between the self and life, like that matrix of life. You can't disentangle the two, which is why I love it. And because when you speak with anyone, everyone has an experience of what it means to have a self and what it means to live a life. So it's kind of this universal experience you have. But when you're talking about psychological concepts, people just get it because they've had a lived experience, and you can just back that up and kind of pad it out with some of the theory, but people know in practical terms what you're speaking about. And that's why I love it, because it's like it's universal.
At what stage did you know that you definitely wanted to pursue being a clinical psychologist?
Yeah, great question, and it's a hard question. Carl Jung, one of my favorite psychoanalysts, you'll see I'll quote him an awful lot on my page. But he says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. And this is the experience I had. Unconsciously, I think I've been pursuing this path most of my life. And I guess I have quite a practical example to demonstrate that, because my parents, during the process of moving out of my childhood home, we have a special box, which is where my mum keeps like important parts of our life story so far. So bits of work, bits like medals, things like that. So I was looking through my special box and I found like a piece of homework, which is essentially like an all about me we had to do at school. And I must have been genuinely about 7 years old at the time. And I'd written in there something like, Like, my ambition in life is to help people find their own path and make the most of what they've got. And it was such a surreal moment looking back at that, because it's like this golden thread that's connected all my life experiences, but I haven't necessarily been conscious of it until more recent years. But you couldn't write it. When I was looking, I was looking back at that kind of piece of homework, and things just started to make sense. I mean, when you look back in retrospect, I can pick out these moments in time that led to me pursuing this as a career. But it wasn't until I was probably applying for university that I really had that moment of like, oh shit, this is what I want to do. Like, this really means something to me. I'm not just pursuing this for the sake of it. Like, it has some deep rooted meaning. So I would say I was quite unconscious of this as a path, but nonetheless pursuing it up until that point of my undergrad degree. And then from that point, it's been a bit more of a conscious venture.
Do you know, as a quite a prominent researcher called Rob Henderson? You come
I
across
don't
Rob
think
Henderson?
so.
He's got quite a presence on Twitter. He does a lot of research on these sorts of things like psychology, sociology. I don't know what his actual specialization is, but one of the things I've heard him share is that if you're struggling with what it is that you want to pursue, often if you rewind back to, I guess when you were 7 years old writing that, or kind of that time period, you can kind of work out retrospectively what it really should be. Even at a very simple level, you can see what your kind of heart posture is, what you're thinking about in your free time as a 6, 7, 8 year old. And that actually would be, if you were free from constraint to choose what you wanted to do in later life, that's probably what you'd go on to pursue. And I guess fortunately for you, you're able to kind of piece those together at the time when you're choosing a degree, and that's kind of sets you on the pathway to really reconnecting with that and pursuing something that truly is something that you're interested in as a career.
Did you say heart posture, by the way?
Yeah.
That's lovely. Yeah, and what you say just there, it makes neurological sense too. Because, I mean, as psychologists, we often bang on about childhood, but there's a good reason why. Because if you think about neurologically speaking, between the ages of, in particular, kind of 0 and 7, this is where we get such immense period of brain growth. So the neurons in our brain and the connections that are made between the brain have their biggest period of growth between these ages. So what happens between the ages of 0 and 7 and your childhood as a whole, it's so important in shaping like this blueprint of your adult brain. It doesn't mean that it's fixed. And that's why I think people, if they haven't had particularly healthy or safe, loving childhood experiences, sometimes worry that that means that it's fixed. And we know that's absolutely not the case. This concept of neuroplasticity, the brain continues to grow and shape and develop and change throughout the lifespan. It slows down after the ages of about 24, but we know that it's like concrete evidence. You can teach an old dog new tricks. Your brain will continue to grow and shape and change throughout life. But nonetheless, this blueprint that you inherit from your early childhood years, it's important and it plays a role. And if you think about interest, the things that you naturally kind of gravitate towards, it's a very raw form of data. You can't really fake interest. I mean, you can to a certain extent. You can perform being interested in something, but in terms of having a felt experience of being interested in something, that's quite an organic form of data. So yes, if you transport yourself back between those ages of 0 and 7, those kind of early childhood experiences, if you start to get curious about what you are naturally drawn to, I think that can be a really useful process in helping understand, what you want to pursue as an adult.
And so what made you interested in the psychology of men and masculinity when you were writing that for your doctoral thesis?
Yeah. Oh, again, big question. I could take different angles with it. The first thing that jumps out to me, and when I think back on my life experiences, this is understandably like a very informative experience, but I don't want to place too much emphasis on it because it's multifaceted. But I guess my dad, as a male kind of figure in my life, my dad struggled quite significantly with his mental health. So he is the most vibrant, creative, loving, unique individual I think probably I've ever met. I've never met anyone quite like my dad. And he sees none of it. Like if he hears this back and he hears me describing that way, he'll be shocked. So he kind of in my life had these periods of absolute euphoria, joy on cloud nine, and then these periods where it was like that soul was sapped out of him. So I kind of saw this same man with two very extreme poles to his personality. And understandably, that's shaped my interest in kind of gender spectrums, in particular the psychology of men and masculinity. Because I think for my dad, self-esteem was a huge part of that, but also things like role, meaning, and purpose. So he's a teacher throughout his life, and I think well equipped to do so, but it wasn't his passion. I don't think it was his thing. I think that he made the most of it, but I think if he had a second shot at it, he would have probably done something quite different. So observing my dad throughout my life and kind of integrating these two poles that I saw in his personality and kind of integrating that into this one figure of my dad, I think has contributed towards me wanting to pursue that as kind of a research interest. But it wasn't all negative. I mean, my dad was also like a huge role model in other ways. He taught me about music, taught me about dance, I guess all the best things in life, food. So I think when I think about my dad's mental health experience, it's quite an easy conclusion to draw that this was really difficult to be around. And of course, I've pursued psychology and the psychology of men and masculinities because maybe unconsciously I want to kind of save my father, that kind of idea. And I think that's part of it, but I don't think it's the whole picture.
And so, what was, if you were to give me like the top line, what was the title of the thesis, and then what were the findings and what were the kind of conclusions, if there were conclusions to it?
Yeah, well, my thesis kind of straddled the idea of kind of gender as a social construct and class as a social construct. So it's all about learning from boys from working class backgrounds around the role of, I guess, narratives around masculinity in the help-seeking process. So going into this study, and it was like a narrative analysis, so it was less about kind of proving a hypothesis and more about exploring individual meaning. So I was particularly interested in the interaction between class and masculinity. I mean, I've grown up in Barnsley, which is like a proud working class ex-mining town. Don't know if you know it, South Yorkshire. And I was always particularly interested in class because I guess it's so much more than just wealth. Because we think about kind of socioeconomic status, but socioeconomic status versus class are kind of two different things. Grayson Perry, artist, did a wonderful documentary about class and taste. So if anyone's interested, I'd recommend giving that a watch because I think that really sums up what it means to have kind of different class brackets. And in particular in the UK, we have a very unique class system. So growing up in Barnsley, this proud working class town, but coming from what would be considered by all intensive purposes quite a middle class family. So I kind of straddled the two, and we weren't wealthy at all. In fact, I was probably in like the bottom percentage in terms of wealth in the class. If you looked at what people were getting for their birthday and Christmas presents, like we were by far, I guess people had always the latest technology, iPhone, and we went in that kind of bracket. So financially speaking, socioeconomic status, we weren't wealthy by any means, but in terms of our class background and taste and the way that my parents kind of approached life, it was more in this kind of middle class bracket, I guess, if you were to roughly categorize it. So at school, we were always kind of considered posh, and that was a really negative thing, especially the way I spoke, and I was so attentive to my accent. I remember once saying that I felt poorly, and I got the piss taken out of me because you don't say poorly, you say poorly. It's poorly, obviously. And being so attentive to my accent in that setting, and then going to university and being considered the opposite of posh. So it's kind of navigating class and seeing just how subjective it was depending on your context. So in terms of the interaction between masculinity and class, if you look at the data, and when I did my literature review, in terms of working class populations, you are much more likely to be prescribed psychotropic medication as opposed to a psychotherapy. You're much more likely as a working class male to go to prison rather than enter kind of therapy services if you have kind of similar mental health presentations. You are much more likely to die by suicide. So as you know, in terms of statistics, 75% of completed suicides are by men, and 3 times as many men who work in construction die by suicide. So the stats are really quite alarming when it comes to men's mental health in the context of class backgrounds. So for my thesis, I wanted to kind of go back to adolescence where some of these class constructs are being, and gender constructs are being developed. And I wanted to have conversations with these boys and see how the narratives they held around masculinity impacted the help-seeking process, if at all. And it was fascinating. I met with some absolutely wonderful boys, young people, we'll go with that. They were kind of 15, 16. And they taught me an awful lot. There were themes in the data, so kind of this idea of manning up and what that meant. And a lot of boys talked about stoicism in the sense of not necessarily kind of denying your emotions, but standing strong in the face of them. And for them, seeking support from like a mental health service would be a sign that you couldn't do it yourself. So there's quite a lot of stigma attached to help seeking in kind of a formal way. But we also have to get curious about what we mean about help seeking. Because for them, if they were experiencing a challenge in their mental health, it wasn't necessarily an obvious route to go to a service. They would talk to their mates, or they might kind of immerse themselves in the gym or in a hobby, or they might kind of speak with family members. So it was help seeking, but just in a less clinical way. So we explored kind of some of the barriers to help seeking in that sense when it came to masculinity, but we also explored the utility of some of those narratives. They talked about kind of being there for themselves, for their families and their friends. This idea of kind of having a strong kind of protector role. And that was something that really bolstered their self-esteem. So as you can probably hear as I'm talking about it, it's not clear cut, and we all take individual meaning from these social constructs. So it's not as simple as saying it's a barrier or it's a facilitator. You have to take a much more nuanced approach than that.
Do you think that the reason why they aren't seeking support in the same way as, I don't know, potentially young girls or women would seek that support is because the support isn't as set up for men, or is it more, or boys, or is it that the boys, is it more on their end that they don't, there's a false belief that it's not set up for them? Like, which do you think there's an element of both, or do you think that the services are kind of equally as equipped for both young boys and women and girls?
Yeah, good question. I think it's probably both. I think on the surface of it, if you look at kind of just visible characteristics when you enter a mental health service, look at psychology, for example, predominantly female-dominated field. As I think you did undergrad psychology yourself, is that right?
I'm wanting to pursue it. Yeah, I don't currently study it, but I want to go on to do a doctorate. Yeah.
Oh, great. I think you'd be brilliant, by the way. But dominated female field. Class is relevant here as well, because I think in order to pursue something like psychology, typically any kind of university level career, you have to have a certain degree of, I guess, financial backing, because it's a long process. And they're like the assistant psychology posts, they're low paid roles. So if you're going to pursue something like that is a long process, you have to have some kind of financial backing, typically, not always, but the majority of psychologists, for example, would probably identify as kind of female middle class background. So I think as a young lad entering a service like that, and if you kind of see those kind of visible markers of difference, I think it's quite easy to draw the assumption that maybe you won't be understood. And obviously, it's not as clear and simple as that. And I think anyone who's considering kind of seeking mental health support, I want to be really clear that that's not something to put them off. Because actually, most of the services I work with, we have like such a motivated, passionate mental health workforce here in the UK, and it's our job to understand you. That's exactly why we're there. So just because you have this assumption that you might not be understood, I think it's so important that you push yourself to test that out. And if you have an experience where you feel like you're not being understood, then that's where you have a conversation and we can get creative about how we do support you. And that's all part of the process. It's this back and forth of trying to make sense of, I guess, your suffering.
Yeah, I'm just trying to like piece this all together, and it's really annoying. I can't remember it exactly, but there's a psychologist who's done quite a lot of different podcasts and things called Adam Lane Smith.
Yeah.
But one of the things, and I can't remember exactly what he says, but he says something to do with the way that the way that depression is for young boys and young girls, and obviously men and women. Like it manifests itself in different ways, and so I suppose for young boys, it might manifest in a way that means that they need to feel, I don't know, like typical masculine tropes, as you've mentioned, of I don't know, protecting and providing, or being respected, or having honor and things. And if they don't feel like they're being useful, then that might be a problem for them. Whereas obviously it manifests differently in girls, and potentially the way I don't know what, as is obviously it's a female dominated field. Maybe there's that kind of dynamic there as well, but I don't know enough about it really to make a comment either way.
No, I think that word you use, useful, is really quite key here. So this idea in psychology that I guess neurologically speaking, men are more wired up to be drawn toward machines, and females are more wired up to be drawn towards people. Now that's a very kind of rash generalization, and obviously it doesn't always work like that, and it's not clear cut. But in my clinical experience, I think men typically are looking for more kind of practical, useful information, whereas women take much more of a kind of an exploratory approach. And again, it's not as clear cut as that. It's just kind of looking at themes in your clinical work. I would say a lot of men that come to therapy want a concrete plan and a concrete kind of vision as to how they can change. Whereas I think women, in my experience, are much more likely to kind of just immerse in the process and see where it takes them.
One thing I thought about when you were mentioning earlier about the reason why different people would pursue a path of psychology. Obviously, there is kind of the cost involved, and the if you can see it, you can be it, and if it's a female dominated field, potentially a working class young man might not feel called to that from that perspective. But one thing kind of popped to mind. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts if you have any. Is that I'm sure you might have come across it, like a political science term called like post-materialism, right? So we live in a world now, for the listeners who maybe not familiar, where as we now have kind of material abundance, and maybe we don't have to struggle and work super hard just to have food on the table and a roof over our heads. Obviously that is the reality for a lot of people, but in a world which is transitioning more towards like abundance of comfort, like, and thinking about ideas and values and principles and these things that we're kind of valuing now in the political space, do you think that the reason why someone from uh, a lower class, middle class background, as opposed to middle class, upper class, doesn't pursue something like psychology, I think you mentioned this earlier, is because they aren't they don't have the capacity to start thinking about all of these kind of post material values and principles and things, because they are more concerned with the day to day, you know, I guess survival, right? I mean, cost of living and things where it's quite difficult. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that. Hopefully, I made sense there. I don't know.
You did. I'm just formulating, I guess, a response.
I've never thought about this before, so
Yeah, it's an interesting angle. And again, I think it's both, which again, there's this idea kind of called dialectics, which features there's a school of thought in therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. And I think dialectics is also part of like a Marxist political ideology. This idea of kind of, it's not one or the other, it's both. And I think a lot of concepts in psychology can be understood this way. It's not I either subscribe to this way of thinking or the other. It's I can take ideas from both. And I think in terms of what you were saying there, I think it's both important that we have the ability to, you said, if you can see it, you can believe it. I think it's both important to have kind of representation in that way. And it's also important to continually update the stereotypes and the beliefs that you hold and take individual responsibility for that. So think if you think of the idea, okay, do I believe that I can become a psychologist? Well, they're going to be external factors that shape your understanding of that. Like, have I seen people like me do it, for example? But we also have a whole internal world that it's our job to update. So, okay, what limiting beliefs do I have that are contributing towards me avoiding that path, for example? What fears do I have? What narratives are in my family culture? If you think right down at that kind of that layer just outside the self, if you think about that family influence, what have my family told me that I am capable of? What have my friends told me that I'm capable of? What messages did I get from school? And I think it's our job to continually revise and update these in light of new evidence. Because we also have, I guess as human beings, we are primed to focus on the negatives. And we are primed to look for the evidence that confirms our negative beliefs. And we get stuck in a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's take the belief like, I'm not good enough to go for it. But what evidence do you have? What concrete, tangible evidence do you have that that is true? And most of the time when you sit down and do this with people, they have a whole stack of evidence that goes against it that they've never really paid attention to, because they've really focused on the evidence that's confirmed that negative belief. And then you get stuck in a cycle because you live your life in a way that is unconsciously reinforcing that belief behind the scenes.
It's really difficult to let go of, isn't it? Because you tie all those things with yourself and the story that you tell about yourself. And previous guest has mentioned that you should always look for disconfirming evidence to make sure you're not in a bubble. But it's even harder, talking about like views and beliefs, but it's even harder when those views and beliefs are about yourself. So, what are the steps that someone can, listening to this, obviously we could go into a lot of detail and there's a lot of nuance for different people's environments and where they are. But like, what are like the practical steps that you'd say in your experience of like coming to unravel those things and kind of off the back of what you've just said about the self-limiting beliefs and things?
Yeah, and it's hard because we said before, as human beings we tend to resist change, but we also hate being wrong. So even if you have a self-limiting belief, we're kind of attached to it because we don't want to be proven wrong. We don't want to admit that this whole time this belief has been disproved. We don't want that. We kind of attach to holding on to these beliefs even if they're not serving us. There's a technique in cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT for short, and it comes from the kind of stoic philosopher Socrates, and it's called Socratic questioning. Now, this is all about providing people with the questions, which is like a key that unlocks the answers in them. So we don't give people the answers, we give them the questions that can hopefully unlock the answers for themselves. And with Socratic questioning, it's like a quest to challenge your assumptions. And it's kind of like you kind of bury down into a statement by asking certain questions. And you can do this for yourself. And it's really just about questioning things. And a good place to start is often look at what you're avoiding. Because we avoid things that we're scared of. And we're scared of them for a reason, typically because it relates to some of our kind of core beliefs. So I'd say in life, look at the things you're avoiding. Say, for example, you're avoiding trying a new hobby. And I think the first question that's important to ask is kind of why. So we're looking at why are you avoiding that hobby? What do you think would happen if you were to go to that class? So, okay, what do you think would happen if you were to go to that class? Well, I wouldn't know what to do. Okay, why would that be such a bad thing? Well, if I don't know what to do, I'm going to look stupid. Okay, why does it matter to you that people think that you look stupid? Well, I want to make sure that I impress people. Okay, what about you makes you think that you won't impress people? Well, because I'm a failure. And then before you know it, kind of by burying down into using these questions, you get to this core belief of I'm a failure. And I'm avoiding this class because I'm scared it's going to confirm this belief that I have that I can't do it.
And so when you unroot that, you then obviously start to look into individual circumstance and why they've come to that belief. And then I suppose that's when someone can really kind of work out whether that's true or whether it's not true and they've just believed a lie potentially. And then I guess, you know, the gradual exposure to that, the gradual voluntary exposure to those uncomfortable scenarios to kind of retrain the brain, which is such a challenging thing, but I suppose something that you've probably seen to good effect in your work. You know, are there any obviously I fully appreciate that you can't mention details or anything with clients and things, but has that been a trend that you've seen? Are there any examples that you can think of broadly, or is that not something you can talk about?
No, and absolutely, I'm happy to give kind of generalized kind of story that's not identifiable. But you said retrain the brain. I love that because it rhymes as well, which is catchy. But when you're retraining the brain, it's back to that principle of neuroplasticity. So how does the brain learn anything new? Well, through repetition, through intense focus. So if we're going to update some of the beliefs that we hold, we have to repeat this over time. I'm not talking about giving it a week and then saying it doesn't work. This is about, it took you, 20 plus years to develop that belief in the first place? It's like a well-worn path. So that pathway in your brain has been trodden on several times on a daily basis over the space of 20 plus years. If we're going to develop a new pathway, a new way of seeing yourself, we're going to have to tread over that path many times for it to become as well worn. So this is a long process, but it's worth it. And if you can find joy in that process, then all the better, because it's going to encourage you to keep going. But in terms of kind of change in clinical clients, like absolutely, I wouldn't do this job if it wasn't possible. This job would be miserable if you never saw people change. Like, you would have to be a sadist to enjoy the job if you only saw people struggle and suffer. So the best part of this job is you kind of get these light bulb moments. Now you can be talking about something over and over for weeks and months, but until someone has like a lived experience of it, it doesn't quite click. And I mean, I've worked with clients who've had the most unbelievable start to life you could ever imagine. And despite that, they go on to do wonderful things, and not just do wonderful things, but like be wonderful people. And there's this idea in kind of stoicism, which also features in CBT. CBT has its roots in kind of stoic philosophy, which is why it's kind of an underrated therapy. It's used quite superficially, but it has very deep roots. And if you think of the roots of CBT and kind of stoicism, it's this principle of it's not what happens to you, it's how you make sense of it that matters. And often in life, the things that happen to us can be absolutely tragic, but it's how we make sense of that seems to matter. And it's the meaning we take from those experiences that can either kind of propel us forwards or really hold us back.
In your own experience and making sense of your upbringing, you were able to use it as an opportunity to kind of go deeper and explore what it means in a postgrad sense, and then obviously pursuing clinical psychology, but equally in a alternative universe or someone in your similar scenario, it could have been a more negative sort of spiral, I suppose, when they start to question these things in an existential and negative way. And I think what I've outlined there essentially speaks to that thing of like two people can have the exact same thing presented on them, but they can be looking at it from a different angle. And that's something which I've really tried to integrate into my life, and I really hope that people do the same, is that you just it's cliche, the glass half full thing, because it's not a very, there can be toxic positivity when you start just ramming these like kind of positive quotes down people's throats, because you don't know what they're going through or what they've been through to get them to where they are. But I think there is something to be said for perspective over circumstance. And actually, I suppose in your work, you've been able to recognize more than most people in life just how resilient and like the ability of people to overcome things which are, which you probably don't hear outside of those doors. There's things that people have gone through, and you see them transform. And I guess it must give you a great appreciation for the ability of people to overcome adversity.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw it in my dad firsthand. In particular, actually, in more recent years, speaking before about my dad maybe not kind of finding his thing. Well, in more recent years, he started volunteering, like Refugee Council. It's a charity in Doncaster. He started volunteering at the Refugee Council. He's kind of pursued his poetry more. And there was a moment that was kind of sat at the dinner table with my parents. And my dad there was this kind of, he'd set up a poetry class with the Refugee Council, kind of writing experiences through poetry that were incredibly traumatic, but kind of processing them and communicating them through poetry. And there was this, like, an award going for, you could kind of submit the poetry. There was like a monetary reward that could go back into the charity to be used to kind of organise trips, classes, things like this. And there was a moment where my dad was kind of questioning whether he should go for it. And if we think about limiting beliefs, the thing that was holding him back was, well, what's the point? What if I go for it and it's embarrassing and it doesn't go further, and then I have to tell everyone that I went for it and didn't get it? And all those self-limiting beliefs came to the surface. And there was a moment where he decided to go for it. And I mean, at that point, the outcome didn't really matter. Like whether they got the prize or not was kind of irrelevant. It's the fact that he chose to put himself out there. He stretched his comfort zone. He faced the possibility of, in inverted commas, failure. Like he chose to face that. And they did get their reward, which was an amazing outcome, but it didn't necessarily matter. It was the fact that that was such a confidence building experience for my dad, because he proved to himself that he could take risks and go for new things, and he could challenge that belief that he wasn't good enough. And that seems to have really unlocked something in him, where I think that he has tested his resilience and his ability to put himself out there. And it's never too late. I mean, my dad's approaching retirement now, but my hope for him is that in this period of retirement that he has now, he realizes that he can really go for things and he can make his life, to a certain extent, what he wants it to be.
Do you think that speaks to the importance of vulnerability in a way which, because I think vulnerability is obviously a risk, because in being vulnerable there is that chance of rejection or embarrassment or failure and all those things, but then it's the being vulnerable which gives the possibility for like a deeper meaning and connection. And
It's like a cruel trick of the universe that it's almost essential for you to feel that vulnerability in order for you to change and develop at all. It's feels like a real risk. And it's back to that idea of kind of imposter syndrome. It's like anytime you do something new, you are going to suck at it. And it's a real knock to your ego, because we tend to surround ourselves with people, with hobbies, with interests, with careers where we feel kind of safe enough. It's like you tend to be drawn to situations where you can be just towards the kind of top of the hierarchy because it feels comfortable. But if you're going to learn and grow and change at all, you need to put yourself in a different sphere where you are kind of middle to bottom. of that hierarchy, because you want to learn and absorb things from the people around you. So if you're going to change at all, it's almost essential that you come to terms with that with your own vulnerability. And there's a concept in acceptance and commitment-based therapy, which is all about kind of this acceptance of feeling. So it's not necessarily good or bad, it just is. You just feel vulnerable right now. And it's about kind of removing that judgment we place on the emotion and just being with it, accepting that it's there. So if we walk around kind of trying to keep our vulnerability and keep these unpleasant feelings at arm's length, we get into a bit of a battle with them. It's like a tug of war. It's like the harder you try and avoid your vulnerability and get away from that feeling, the harder the vulnerability tugs back. So not only do you have the unpleasant, I guess, sensation of the emotion, you also have this struggle that's going on in the background. And the kind of principle of ACT, acceptance and commitment-based therapy, is to kind of metaphorically drop the rope. So rather than struggle with the feeling, you accept that it's there and you learn to tolerate it. And it's a very slight kind of shift in perception that can make a huge difference when facing uncomfortable emotions like that.
Do you think, like, and just to before we move on to maybe just a slightly different discussion, because this is all kind of come out of the discussion on your doctoral thesis, and then everything that's kind of come out of that in conversation. But just trying to like tie these two things together, even though they might not be linked, but we'll see. Do you think that that experience of sitting with emotion and feeling it, and having that kind of stoic sense of, this too shall pass, good or bad, just experiencing what life is and the joy of, the gratitude that you should have in order to just feel that, even if it is a negative response to something. Do you think that potentially links with the way that I don't know, young boys, young men experience emotion, and is it the inability to even acknowledge that they are feeling a way that they've kind of programmed in their head that, oh, I shouldn't feel this way, I should be, strong and masculine and man up? Do you think that it's an inability to sit with that is being detrimental to the mental health of young men?
I think that's a great reflection. And this kind of distinction is partly what draws my curiosity to the psychology of men and masculinity, because it's this distinction between like an external and internal world. So I went to a jiu-jitsu class once, and I say once because it absolutely blew my mind. Maybe I'll come back to it in later life, but not now. It's like human chess. It's absolutely amazing.
It's great. I've also been once.
Yeah, not quite yet. Maybe when you have more time to dedicate to it. It's so complicated, isn't it? But I was just amazed, in particular, because I guess kind of male-dominated in spaces in some ways. This particular class I went to was anyway. I was amazed at the strength and resilience of these men to put themselves through kind of physical pain and, like I said, this external discomfort. And when we got kind of chatting about internal states, emotions, thoughts, feelings, it was this real distinction between they kind of mastered this external world. When it came to tolerating the discomfort of their internal world, there was huge avoidance. And that really blew my mind, because I feel like I'm kind of the opposite way wired. It's like I feel like I'm quite able to sit and tolerate unpleasant thoughts and feelings when it comes to my internal world. But in terms of external pain and discomfort, I've been trying cold showers and I'm up to about generally 15 seconds. Like, can't tolerate it. So it's this kind of difference. I was absolutely blown away by the amount of stress they put their bodies through in this external kind of world. But when it came to tolerating that same stress and discomfort internally, it was terrifying. And I think as a psychologist, when you're working therapeutically with people, you are asking an awful lot of them to delve into that internal world and come to terms with some of these thoughts and feelings that absolutely knock you off your feet. That's part of what we do in a kind of a therapeutic process. It's this concept of like a window of tolerance. It's like the amount of stress and distress you are able to tolerate before becoming overwhelmed. And just sitting with your emotions and allowing yourself to feel them is a huge part in this process. If you ever see someone on the verge of tears, you can physically see in action the way that they avoid that. And allowing yourself, and it's not about becoming overwhelmed with the emotion and being kind of taken over by it, but it's about allowing yourself to experience it. It's like a wave. It has a peak, it has a kind of climax, and then it troughs at the end. And allowing yourself to feel that full spectrum and that full wave of the emotion takes a hell of a lot of strength and resilience. And it's something that I think is completely underrated.
Do you think in the same way as the in terms of the physical world, say a man, I don't know, in his 20s or 30s goes to jiu-jitsu, they're able to put themselves in that voluntary discomfort and put themselves into very challenging scenarios. I've lost my train of thought slightly, but oh no, I've completely lost it. That's really annoying. I was like trying to kind of relate how if you were to frame emotions in the same way to that person as it is in the physical space, like, do you think they'd be more like receptive to it? There's something I was like trying to get at. It's just completely gone. But
No. I think you articulated that well. And if I'm on that same stream of thought, this will make sense. If not, maybe I've missed the point. I think there's something to be said for making thoughts and feelings more tangible. We said before about like men are more kind of drawn to machines, women are more drawn to people, that kind of brash distinction that isn't accurate, but it kind of works. And when we're talking about thoughts and feelings, because we can't physically see them, the language around it can feel quite fluffy. It's hard to grasp. It's hard to know, like, what do you actually mean? When you say that, what does that mean in like a physical sense? In particular, when it comes to thoughts, I like to think about like what a thought actually is. I mean, every thought has an electrical signal and it has a chemical component. So thoughts have a very physical basis. We can literally see them in the brain if we look at kind of MRI scanning. This is with the development of AI, artificial intelligence. We are like every day we are having kind of revelations in the brain and the way that the brain works, to the point where there's a form of AI where you can literally kind of take an image from a brain scan, take the signaling of the thought and translate that into an image. So we can see physically as technology develops that thoughts have a very tangible basis to them. So people tend to not take their thoughts, I guess, very seriously because they think, oh, it's just a thought. But we know that every thought has this physical basis to it. So the way that you think is very important and it has a physiological effect. So it's one thing kind of thinking about changing your thoughts and paying attention to your thoughts in terms of the what, but I think people need to know the why that's important in order for them to kind of put it into practical steps.
I think the why is the most existential and important question to ask of absolutely anything. It's just,
Absolutely.
it's just a cyclical thing of going, okay, X, Y, X, Y. As you mentioned earlier with with someone that doesn't want to start doing a new class or take up a new hobby, it's just always asking that question why to kind of try and unroot that. I find it interesting the interplay between the mental and the physical. How someone can feel angry, so they can go to the physical world to try and like let that anger out, but also that the physical world can then result in feeling an emotion. And I think, obviously, as you've said, with men, potentially a general theme is, they're able to deal with it in the physical world, but not in sort of not sort of the mental world. It kind of ties towards a few of the topics we've touched on, but it's something that you sent to me before we recorded this podcast as a potential thing to discuss. And I think it's probably quite interesting because obviously it's a very universal experience. Life, everyone who's listening to this podcast hopefully is alive. And we're all going through this journey. And you mentioned the human life cycle at a very top level. You put in brackets development and then existentialism, which I found quite funny reading, because it's like, obviously that's an etc, but it's just like life cycle, development, existentialism.
Yeah.
But it probably is, it probably can be, if I'm interpreting what you put there correctly, is, you kind of come into this life, you're trying to make sense of what's around you, and you get to the stage of, asking those questions between, I don't know, the ages of 15 and then beyond, I suppose, as you're developing self-awareness and you're asking the more broad questions about who you are, about the universe, about everything, life. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of ask a bit more about that, if you could expand about what the human life cycle is, and then obviously hopefully be some like questions off the back of that can be useful for people to listen to.
It says like the history of psychology. We've often paid an awful lot of attention to the development of children, kind of those formative developmental years. And it was actually a psychotherapist called Erickson. It's not Erickson, the name escapes me, who then thought about the human life cycle in terms of these later stages. It is Erickson. I think it is Erickson. He paid more attention to the kind of adult life part of the life cycle. He kind of categorized development into kind of set stages, with each stage having a particular task. If you think of kind of the adolescent period, he categorizes this in terms of like identity versus role confusion. So it's a time where you kind of form your identity and your kind of pathway into the kind of adult matrix, or you experience a significant amount of distress around your kind of confusion in that role. So we know it's not as kind of clear cut as having these stages in life, but we know that at each point of your life cycle, you have a particular task to pay attention to. Jung again talks about individuation, which is kind of like, if you think about like an acorn to an oak tree, it's like everything that oak tree will ever be is kind of contained right in the part of that acorn. And as a human being, it's kind of like everything we are as an adult, to a certain extent, is contained in our DNA at the point of conception. Now, it's not just nature. We know it's nature and nurture. There's also this field of epigenetics, which is, I guess, the interaction between your genetic material and the environment that you're raised in. So we know that the environment that you're raised in and the experiences that you have can literally change your material at a genetic level. But as a human being, I guess you have the kind of bulk of your raw material right there at the start of conception. And throughout your life, you develop and you change into your kind of adult form, I guess. And Jung talked about individuation as this quest to understand yourself and understand the part that you play in life. And that's never just kind of one thing. Like, I don't personally believe that we have one thing that we're destined to do or be or become, but it's this quest of getting closer to your version of that truth that's important. And Jung would say we never really get there. There's never like an end destination with individuation. But as you begin to pursue your path and what feels authentic for you, there's a whole host of kind of positive psychological benefits. Like, it feels good to be working towards something in that way.
I suppose that becomes most apparent when you enter those stages of transitioning from childhood to adulthood, when you're sort of wrestling with what career path you choose, and
Yeah, absolutely.
the hobbies that you associate with, and how those habits kind of compound into your 20s and 30s and whatnot. And obviously that's probably a stage of life that I'd imagine the majority of the demographic of listeners are, if the Spotify analytics or anything to go by, about 2/3 of people are 18 to 30 who listen to this. And obviously I'm 22, so I'm exactly in this kind of journey and working things out. And part of that working things out is this podcast. But yeah, I
Good
mean,
for you. Yeah.
how would you advise someone in that sort of stage of their human life cycle in working out what it is that they feel is authentically their path?
Yeah. And if I had the answer to that, I mean, we'd all figure out. Right. It's an excruciatingly difficult part of the life cycle, and I think it's one that doesn't necessarily get enough attention. It's kind of this idea of we go through this huge stage of development. There's this flux between your kind of childhood, adolescent years, and then it's this assumption that like we just crack on then and things become routine, and it never works like that. And it's really, really hard. And because it's so hard, I would encourage people to get playful with it. Like as human beings, it's Vygotsky again who says that we learn best through play. And as children, we're quite able to do this quite naturally. We immerse in the rhythms of life, we get into that flow state. And as adults, things become quite rigid quite fast. And we kind of forget that we learn through play and curiosity. And I'd say get experimental, try different things, see how it feels, try it on for size. And that's not with this expectation that you try something and you have a light bulb moment and it all makes sense and it's earth-shatteringly beautiful. I mean, if it was as obvious as that, then we'd all be in paths that were incredibly fulfilling to us. It's not that easy. It takes graft as well. And I think it's kind of a process of finding something that's good enough, you're interested enough in it, and then putting the hard work in to train yourself to like it. And it's that idea again with neuroplasticity and repetition. It's like the more you practice something and the better that you get at it, the more rewarding it will feel. But whilst you're in those early stages of trying out something new, you are going to feel vulnerable, you are going to feel out of your depth, but that's not the reason to turn your back on it. So it's I would encourage people to see it as quite an organic process, but one that also takes a lot of work. So find something that's interesting enough and then dedicate yourself to getting better at it.
I think in a world which values the now and the instant reward, instant feedback loops, it can be quite hard to take a step back and kind of let go of that and let organically your life choices, and obviously with repetition, as you say, you kind of linking back to what we said earlier in the podcast, you know, through that repetition you become more competent, therefore you become more confident, and it will kind of, you're kind of making your way. And I think there's obviously a message which helpful or harmful, depends on the person, depends on how it's conveyed, but this whole, the setup of education that we currently have generally in the West of, you know, school, university, or, you know, and then suddenly career path can be quite challenging to navigate, as it's also evolving with AI and stuff, right? So it's like, okay, how do I fit in? How am I useful? How am I finding purpose here? And I suppose, like previous guest Charlie Rogers, he talks about the squiggly career, and he has this concept of just like gaining a portfolio of like a wide variety of experience, using your 20s to learn rather than earn, and just taking time to, you know, obviously you're growing up and maturing in some ways, but not growing up too much as to, you know, have your whole life set, because, you know, the fun and the play is in spontaneity often, and if you've got your next 20 years mapped out, then, you know, there's not much room for all of that to kind of come out of nowhere.
I really like that concept. It's and I think culturally we're setting up that narrative, as you say, about kind of quick wins. That if something feels right, it should be instantaneous, and we know that that's not how the human life cycle works. It's more about the journey than it is the end outcome, as naff as that sounds. But life is to be immersed in, not rushed through and completed. It's kind of like you're chasing the thing and you're chasing the thing. You're at school and then you're told, oh, high school is going to be great. You have more freedom at high school. You can walk yourself home at high school, and you're chasing the thing. And then you finish high school and you're at college and you're told, oh, yeah, interested in university or career path, or you can kind of choose what you want now. When you finish that, you'll feel great. And then you finish that and you still don't feel great. And then you're in your career and then you're chasing the thing, and then you retire and you think, I'm here. Like, oh, retirement. Everyone says, yeah, life's pretty good after retirement. This is where my parents are at right now. Suddenly have this freedom and they're like, oh, my life's gone. If not more. It's like, now I have all this time, but I'm feeling a bit creaky. And like, I think we're set up to chase this thing, and it's often retirement, freedom, whatever that is. And we've missed half of our life in the process. It's I think one of the most important questions alongside why that you can ask yourself, and this was what my partner asked for me, is the first time I've actually been asked it and made to think. And he asked, like, what do you want? Like, what do you want from your life? Like, this is your one and only life cycle here on earth, depending on your, I guess, spiritual beliefs. But this is in this form, in this body, in this life, in this time. This is your one and only shot. What do you want to do with it? And when you're asked that question, your first reaction is often to freeze because it's too much. Like, that's too much freedom. Take it away from me. I'll give someone else that responsibility. But if you can sit and wrestle with that for long enough, ultimately you get to craft your reality, again, to a certain extent. But the opportunity to craft your reality as an adult, I think it's a double-edged sword. It terrifies us, but it also is the thing that can fulfill us.
And do you think in asking that question, too many people default to, oh, I want to feel happy, as opposed to I want to find meaning, and where that meaning is found is not necessarily always like the kind of jovial experience of, oh, I feel happy today, the sun's out. It's like meaning is obviously so much deeper and can be often in times of suffering and challenging moments in life, but it's such a deeper experience. And you, I suppose, with that, as we've spoken about in the podcast, it's like sitting with certain emotions, observing them, feeling them, but doing it on a journey, in a pathway that brings fulfillment. And I suppose, like with your work, it's very much I don't know how you describe it, but it's very much like serving others, right? Like, you know, your career path and being a clinical psychologist, and the heart for what you do is very much wanting to observe people's lives and then ask them the right questions. And then obviously, you know, with all the other kind of things that you do, that I'm hopefully going to learn over the next, number of years, but
Yeah.
like, you're there in a serving role, and that is what provides you with meaning, because it's not always happy. You know, there's probably
Yeah.
lots of challenging moments where, you hear things and you have to resolve them, and it must be quite a challenge. Actually, one of the questions, just to off the back of that, is, have you found it challenging in your experience, clinically, to, because obviously you have to remain relatively impartial and external, but then obviously you're probably weighed down by a lot of the experiences that you hear people say. So, and that probably applies not just to your role, but in different ways to other people, in their lives, when they're kind of weighed down by experiences of others and opinions and things. So, like, how do you resolve and I don't want to say cope or deal with, because that's not really that's not what it is. But yeah, how do you manage your own mental health whilst helping others' mental health, is the question.
There's a school of thought in more kind of psychodynamic psychotherapies where, as a therapist, you ought to be a blank slate. And this is kind of there for good reason. It's kind of, you remove as much of yourself from the interaction as possible so that the person can almost kind of project onto you what they almost need you to be. It's like, it's not about you, it's about them. So you need to remove as much of your stuff as you can from that interaction so you can kind of solely focus on theirs. And as I say, I think it's there for good reason, but in kind of practical terms, when you're joining someone on their life venture like that, it's inevitable that you bring a part of yourself into the work. And this is where there's a lot of flexibility in the field of psychology to kind of develop your own style. And again, one of my favorite psychotherapists is called Irvin Yalom, and he is obsessed with the relationship, and he actually brings an awful lot of himself into the relationship, because for him that's all about kind of congruence and authenticity. He wants to give people a genuine reaction of how he responds to them, and he wants to provide context from his own life as to how he has had that reaction. So it's a very kind of organic human connection that he believes is the driver of psychological change. So kind of different schools of thought in psychotherapy, and as I say, there's a certain degree of flexibility to see how you fit in that. So where possible, and I think it's useful to stand out of the way. I think having your own psychotherapy alongside being a therapist is an essential part of that, because you get to develop an awareness about what is your stuff and what is the client's, as much as possible anyway. And understandably, when you are joining people in their venture, and when you are joining people often in the pit of their suffering, it will have an impact on you. This is where your boundaries are incredibly important as a therapist. You need to start and end the session on time, because that sends a message to both your client and yourself that this is time limited. So boundaries are incredibly useful. That blank slate theory is useful to a certain extent, but ultimately I do bring parts of myself into my clinical work. And the way I protect myself with that is, I guess, my own psychotherapy where needed, reflection spaces, supervision with people that I absolutely trust, and I guess engaging in my own self-development. Because as a therapist, you are the tool. You cannot blame the piece of equipment or the paper or the documents or the processes or whatever. It's like you're bringing yourself into the work. You are part of that agent of change. So I think it's inevitable that there's going to be some overspill of yourself and your own beliefs and your own experiences into the work, but where possible, you ought to minimize that so that the client can get the full benefit from the work.
And just reflecting on sort of where you are now, you kind of mentioned it a couple of times in the podcast, but what is the most meaningful thing about not even work, but just your life at the moment? Like, obviously, it could be part of work, but where do you find meaning most today?
Yeah. I think, and at this point in my career, it's become a borderline obsession at times, but which I think is credit to how much it means to me. But I have to be careful with that, to not neglect like the other parts of life that are important to me. In particular, I mean, relationships are everything. Human connection is everything. Family, friends, partner, nourishing that outside of the work. And again, that's why boundaries are really important. Myself and my partner, actually, we have like a rule that past like 9 p.m. we don't talk about anything psychology related. And it's very hard not to, like I said before, because psychology and life are kind of entwined. You cannot separate the mind from the world. So everything you talk about ultimately has a psychological underpinning. So it's very hard to keep it boundaried when it is your career and you're also living your life. It's very hard to keep the two kind of separate and have your kind of professional self and your personal self. And that's where at the moment, this is where I'm trying to really nurture like my personal self by exploring different hobbies. That's where jiu-jitsu came into it, but timing's not right just yet. But this is where I'm actively kind of looking to pursue things that sing to my soul. And again, that's a process. That's something you can get playful with. And outside of work, that's something that I guess is meaningful to me at the moment, finding something I can really lock into.
I think people often joke that, you know, if you're friends with a clinical psychologist or psychologist, that they're gonna, you know, just start analyzing
Yeah.
your brain and stuff. And people have even said it about me. It's like, I haven't even studied psychology undergrad, but just because I have an interest in it doesn't mean I'm just gonna start analyzing people. Although I probably
Except you
do
do.
subconsciously.
Yeah.
I can't help it.
Yeah.
There was even a moment in second year uni where I was at the pub with like 6 of my mates, and for a good 45 minutes, I just went round them and I just like, because they wanted me to. They were like, Zach, we're just gonna. I was like, I'm not qualified or whatever, but they're like, yeah, just pick out things that you think deeply motivate our behaviors in positive and negative ways. And yeah, I don't know. It was an interesting moment I wasn't expecting, but I was like, well, I guess this is a good indicator of you know, what I'm pursuing. But anyway, I've been hugely interested and curious in everything you've said, and I'm very grateful for your time and in sharing everything you've done. We've covered a lot today. I feel like it's a combination of like really understanding like who you are in a way that can be really useful to people, but then also exploring topics such as boys, masculinity, mental health, the human life cycle, self-limiting beliefs, all of these things that kind of come together and hopefully can not only educate people who are listening to this, but also give them practical advice, and hopefully people feel like they're being spoken to when they've listened to this. So I really appreciate your time. If people can get in touch, or if they want to follow more of what you do, how can they do so?
Yeah, well, I want to say a huge thank you to you. I'm not used to being on this side of the hot seat, but you asked some really interesting questions that unlocked parts of my brain that I wasn't aware we were going to go to today. So that was a really valuable experience. So thank you. If people do want to find out more about me, I have my website, which is www.drmarthaharrison.co.uk. I have my Instagram page, which is Circle Time. There's some deep meaning to that, I guess, to the name of that,
I
which
was
we
going to
won't go
ask, but
into.
yeah.
Yeah, but at Circle Time is my Instagram page. And you can find me on Psychology Today, which is like a register of private therapists and psychotherapists.
Cool. Fantastic. And thank you everyone for listening.